This week on A Hell of a Picture, we stay inside the ropes for another look from the fighter's perspective with Scorsese's Raging Bull. We open the show this week by talking about the partnership between Scorsese, De Niro, and Pesci before we explore Jake LaMotta, the man and the character. I bring us through some of the sights and sounds of the film, while Dave brings up his issues with the dialogue. We debate the ending of the film by dissecting a biblical quote and a Brando reference before looking ahead to the 3 remaining films in the trio's quartet. This podcast could have been somebody. Or is it, this podcast could have been somebody? These kind of things matter. That's this week on Hell of a Picture. Welcome to Hell of a Picture, a weekly movie podcast where we discuss an unforgettable film and if it truly is a hell of a picture. My name is Andrew Bartlett, and I'm sitting across the internet, as I do each and every week, from the Robert De Niro to my Martin Scorsese, Mr. David Hollingshurst.
Okay, I feel it's incumbent upon me now to do a De Niro impression, which I will
Please
not
do.
No, my De Niro is no good. So there you go. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, De Niro is...
You have to compress your face a little bit. You got to look like you've been hit with a shovel. I think that's a big thing. Like, you need to have taken a spade to the face. There you have it. Yeah. For those of you not watching video, Andrew's face looks like it's been... Yeah.
Exactly. You can't really do a De Niro. Like, I can't do the voice of De Niro. It's like, but you like... You meet,
I don't know. Maybe you got it.
Me. We're gonna meet.
I hear things.
Meet the parents. You're gonna meet me. It's more of a. It's a face. It's a face. It's not really.
It's very much in the face.
It's very much in the face. But welcome to Hell of a Picture. We're if you haven't followed us on socials, make sure you follow us. We're not really updating our socials currently, but I'm going to get on top of that.
So it's a great follow. It's a great follow, but soon enough, things are in the works. Things are happening. We have lots of things happening, moving. We're going to start some fun stuff coming up. So be sure you're following us on all socials, on YouTube. You can watch us, you can like and subscribe, and that always helps us with the podcast. So be sure to do that, because this week we're diving into real run of films here with our Marty Scorsese, Robert De Niro, and Joe Pesci three-way. The films that involved those 3 men, and we're going to talk about them all. Not all today, but we're going to start today with a banger. Yes, absolutely. We will get to all of them in due course. This, as you described, cinematic 3-way, which I'm sure is the best way to describe it. But starting today with Raging Bull, 1980, classic for sure. Was the first time that I'd seen it. I had not watched it, though I did remember parts of it. So I must have been privy to a screening of it at some point. Maybe I was in the room briefly. Maybe I fell asleep, something like that, because there were parts that were vaguely familiar. But this was definitely the first dedicated watch I had. And very interested to talk about it. It was a film that required some processing for me afterwards. I had to think about this for a bit before I could even start writing on it. So, yeah, interested to talk about it.
Before we dive into your rundown to catch us all up on Raging Bull and our deep dive discussion, did you watch anything this week, David?
I did, actually. I didn't watch, apart from this, I didn't watch any movies, but I did finish up the most recent season of Only Murders in the Building, which is an absolute joy to watch. I know I have waxed on to you about how much I love that show. And though I will say this wasn't the best season. It's still just a treat, honestly. Like, the cast is so strong. Right. Even when it's not at its best, I still find it charming just because of who they are and how great they are. And it's just a lot of fun.
Yeah, I need to get on board with that because I love everybody in there. So that's next on my watch list. But I started the Apple original show Severance. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I
And
am. I
Scott,
watched like the first episode or so and just didn't
yeah,
come back to it. Not because I didn't like it, but just because I'm bad at
uh,
TV. But
yeah, Ben Stiller created it, I think. And man,
he did.
it is. It was. I've heard really great things about it. It was very intriguing, very well written, and really cool concept. So yeah, I'm excited to continue with that. I'll definitely get into more Severance as I go.
Apparently,
But
they filmed some of
okay,
that
so
in
yeah.
Newfoundland, actually, or maybe in the. I think there might have been a second season where they did do some shooting in an Al. Yeah,
Oh wow, yeah, because Ben Stiller was here. Like at
he
some
was.
point, he was like,
Yeah, I think it was like
oh, so
last
that's what
summer
they.
or 2 summers ago, something like that.
Yeah, he was like scouting places, and then I guess yeah. Okay, interesting. So I
Hmm.
think it might have been season 2. I feel like you're right. I feel like I remember hearing that. So okay, cool. Well, I'm gonna keep an eye out for that for sure. Okay. So we've got the pleasantries out of the way, and now we're gonna go to battle in this boxing brute matchup of discussing Raging Bull. Can you start us off with
Fabulous.
the rundown?
I certainly will. I will save us all with the rundown. So, in the 1940s, Jake LaMotta was an indomitable middleweight fighter looking to earn a shot at the title. He will fight anyone willing to get into the ring with him, and is a notorious brawler whose stylistic leaning is one of punishment, and not only for his foe, but for himself as well. Now, Jake is managed by his brother Joey, and the two live and train in the same New York neighborhood they grew up in, where people bicker constantly and manners are in short supply. In this era, the mafia looms over the sport of boxing, exerting its influence on who gets a shot and sometimes who wins. Jake, true to his namesake, is stubborn in his resolve to do things his way, while Joey, the more skilled politician and likable of the two brothers, tries to keep relations amicable with the people who may control Jake's fate. Jake will eventually get his title shot and win, but not before taking a very obvious dive in a fight where he still doesn't actually fall down. And along the way, we watch a man in and out of the ring who is paranoid, domineering, and possessive of all the things he really ought to love. And we witness the breakdown of 2 marriages, the loss of a brother, and an eventual fall from grace that sees a champion imprisoned before becoming a comedian telling bad jokes and worse poetry to a nightclub rabble that eventually aren't laughing anymore. Raging Bull was released in 1980 and directed by Martin Scorsese. The screenplay was written by Paul Schrader and Mardik Martin, and based on Raging Bull, My Story, by Jake LaMotta himself, who also served as consultant on the picture. It stars Robert De Niro as the titular Jake LaMotta, Joe Pesci as Joey LaMotta, Kathy Moriarty as Vicky LaMotta, and Scorsese mainstay Frank Vincent as Salvi. Raging Bull cost $18 million to make and brought in a kind of disappointing $23 million at the box office. The critical response at the time, along with the audience, was kind of a mixed bag. De Niro received praise, and rightly so, for his performance, and the film's editing was widely acclaimed, but many detractors noted the violent content as a mark against the picture. Now, regardless of critical hand-wringing, the film would be nominated for 8 Oscars that year, including Best Picture, Best Director, Lead Actor, Supporting Actress, Film Editing, Sound Editing, and Cinematography, winning for Best Actor, De Niro's second, and Best Film Editing for Thelma Schoonmaker, whose combination of names alone, I would say, is deserving of an award. I love both Thelma and Schoonmaker. That's top stuff. In the years since, Raging Bull has become known as one of the best films ever made and was selected in its first year of eligibility for preservation in the United States Film Registry by the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. In 2007, the American Film Institute ranked Raging Bull 4th on its updated list of 100 greatest mostly American films ever made. And I say mostly because some of these movies are basically British, but they were financed with American dollars. So it creates a bit of a gray area in what constitutes an American film. You will see things on there like Lawrence of Arabia, Bridge over the River Kwai, etc., etc. And that is your rundown.
Nice. The I forget what was it. Um, this film lost out to Dances with Wolves. Dan-
No, I
I
think it was
feel like
Elephant
that's
Man.
what.
Elephant Man was the big winner that year. It had 8 nominations as well. There were some interesting films in that year's Oscars. Like Empire Strikes Back was there. Elephant Man was there. There was there was a couple of notable names in the 53rd Oscars. It was.
Yeah, I feel like Ordinary People. Yeah,
Hmm.
that won Best Picture. Interesting. Yeah, because I'm just like, yeah, Empire. There was a bunch of really ordinary people, and then Robert Redford. Yeah, see, like, I've never seen Ordinary People.
No, nor
But
I.
and
The
I
coal
feel like
miner's
it's
daughter. Did
probably
that start the trend of like titles where it's like the somebody something, like the time traveler's optometrist and the caveman's gynecologist or whatever? It's just like seems like there's a lot
something
of
like
those
that.
now. Yeah.
Yeah, nothing against Robert Redford, but like I feel like Raging Bull probably has longer lasting appeal than Ordinary People, but I'm a bit biased. We're today, so this little string of Scorsese movies that we're going to be talking about over the coming weeks. We focused on Scorsese and De Niro and Pesci, and sort of their the three of them working together. I mean, you could just do De Niro and Scorsese, but they have kind of abundance of films. I don't know how many they've done together. I think it's
10.
10.
It's 10.
10,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
it's
that's a
pretty
lot.
wild.
So
Yeah.
we wanted to throw Pesci in there, and sort of have the three-way to kind of narrow down our discussion. And they have obviously very specific genre or a specific kind of like subject to their films as well. Do you want to start us off with some I don't know, some backstory on Scorsese and De Niro and Pesci?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, as you said, they've done a ton of work together. At this point, when in 1980, when Raging Bull comes out, Scorsese's got 7 features to his name, actually, including Mean Streets and Taxi Driver,
Right.
both of which star De Niro, and both of which really feel on brand for Scorsese. Excuse me, because when most of us think of his work, what comes to mind are these gritty street tales of hard men doing bad things.
Right.
But in those first 7 films, and I think in his filmography thereafter, you do see a lot more diversity than I think most people tend to realize.
Yeah, he sort of has this wide range of subjects and ideas that he plays with. But there's this idea that you, as a filmmaker, you want to shoot what you know, right? And especially sort of early on in your career, like uh, it's what he knows. He grew up in sort of like the low income streets of like Italian neighborhoods in New York, and he was, he had a sort of very narrow and small world. Scorsese, this is Scorsese. He was actually as a young child, he had like really bad asthma and like was like sick constantly. So he was like actually like forced to like stay inside a bunch, which got him to watching just tons and tons of television and movies. And that's where he sort of watched all of his movies. He sort of became this like cinephile by being like this recluse child. But when he was out, he was like, his world was like sort of those streets. He lived like next door to a church, and he was like Catholic, and that's obviously like very prominent in his films. And then
Mm-hmm.
sort of like the lower income neighborhood that he was sort of grew up in. And so he has this idea and these images of what it is to grow up in that world and know what it is. And it's like from there, then you can explore different characters and different stories and more interesting ideas. So like, yeah, so it's like he doesn't necessarily understand the sports boxing world like in Raging Bull, but he understands the other side of it. And yeah, I think from there he can jump off and do films like Age of Innocence and Cape Fear and other movies that he
New
sort of
York, New York. Yeah, The Last
New
Temptation of
York, yeah.
Christ. All kinds of different. Yeah.
Yeah, like New York, New York is a musical, right? And it's like, but he has sort of knows. That's why a lot of his films are sort of these character-based pieces.
Yeah, New York, New York also does famously star De Niro. So, and that was one of his first seven
Right.
films. So 3 of 7 for his, by 1980 have starred De Niro. So obviously, right from the get go, there is this really foundational relationship for both of them in their
Yeah.
professional and personal lives. And so ultimately, Scorsese will make to date 26 films, 10 of those starring De Niro, and Pesci appearing in four of those 10, obviously. Um, One thing I wonder, because I think if with another collaboration, we might start to experience fatigue as an audience. Like, does it seem at all odd to you that all of us, the collective movie going public, just keeps wanting to see these guys together? Because I don't really hear or sense a lot of resentment or fatigue towards them constantly working together and constantly putting out movies, which in a lot of cases do share a similar sort of subject matter or content.
Um, yeah, well, I'm not sure that so many people got didn't not get fatigue from them working together, because I think it's like they worked a bunch. They sort of, like you said, it was like they did Mean Streets, they did New York, New York, they did Taxi Driver, they did Raging Bull, then he did Cape Fear, and then he did then they did Goodfellas, they did Casino in the 90s, and then they sort of stopped working together for like 25 years, and then they made
Mm,
2 movies in the span of like 3 years, The Irishman and Killers of Flower Moon.
right.
So like they sort of had this, like, I don't think it was a case of them getting fatigued of one another or getting tired of one another or people not wanting to see them together. I think they just got interested in other things and telling other stories. And like De Niro sort of went off and sort of started doing like the Meet the Parents stuff and the comedies and sort of like
That's right.
getting his bag, like, you know what I mean? And Scorsese, he found a new muse in DiCaprio. I mean, he did
That's
Departed
right.
with DiCaprio and The Aviator and then Wolf of Wall Street. And then he just started working with DiCaprio. And, it's a lot to be said about like a director and an actor's sort of connection. And it's like, I know for Scorsese and De Niro, and I would assume for DiCaprio as well, is like there's this, it's not a I'm directing you or I'm in charge of you. It's very much a collaboration. And these guys are very much working together. And it's like, I know for Scorsese, he like very much respects De Niro and what he's bringing to the table. And he's going to let him guide Scorsese's direction versus, the other way around. And if there's something that
Mm,
Scorsese wants, he's going to guide him gently into that direction. You know, they're contemporaries. They grew up in the same neighborhood, a couple of neighborhoods apart. They were like friends, or they're friends. They had friends, like mutual friends. They didn't necessarily grow up together, but like they were like, oh yeah, it's so and so's buddy. I know, whatever. They finally met at a Christmas party with where Brian De Palma introduced them, director Brian De Palma,
yeah.
and they were like, yeah, I know you, and they sort of like were interested in one another, and then they worked on Mean Streets, and then and Scorsese was or sorry, De Niro was just like masterful in that, and but it was actually during that time that De Niro first started reading the autobiography of Jake LaMotta, and
Mm,
he pitched it to Scorsese then, which was like years before they actually made it. He was like, he was like, oh, I'm reading this book, you should read it. And Scorsese was like, yeah, okay, like not really interested in boxing or anything. And it took him years to convince him. Like he didn't know anything about boxing and care about sports. He was just, for De Niro though, De Niro liked that stuff, but he was also just really intrigued by the story of this guy. It's like autobiography really like impacted him, and he kept hounding Scorsese. Scorsese was like, he was in the hospital. So like I watched a bunch of these documentaries, And one thing they sort of all danced around was like Scorsese was like, like after Taxi Driver, I went and made like The Last Waltz, and I was like debating on what I wanted to do, and he was going to like move away to Rome and like make movies in Italy, and he was like torn between like making Hollywood movies, but he kept kind of like dancing around the idea that he was like I was in a bad place, and like it was like, oh, he was just like a crazy drug addict probably. That's what I gather. This is Scorsese, and he just was like in the 70s just doing like tons of blow and just getting fucking ruined, and his body was like, no, we can't do this. And he's like literally in the hospital, and De Niro visited him and was like, are we going to make this movie or not? That's essentially what he said. It was kind of like, okay. So that's when they started to really hone in and start prepping and get ready to make Raging Bull.
Well, it's interesting because one thing I did come across in research for this was that there was a possibility that this was Scorsese's last movie. And
yes,
apparently okay, so that is true. Yeah. And he attacked it, with a fervor of a man working on his last project. And particularly in the editing room, apparently he was just dogged in his pursuit of perfection. And I think that does really come across. But you talked about De Niro's fascination with the character, with the man, Jake LaMotta. And we talked about Rocky last week, a character who predates Raging Bull on screen by a few years and a couple of movies, or at least one movie anyway. But where Rocky was a fictional character based on an amalgam of real-life boxers, Raging Bull is an adapted autobiography, like you mentioned, and one that by all accounts is extraordinarily accurate. LaMotta was every bit as obstinate in the ring as he's depicted. In 106 professional fights, nobody ever knocked him down, which is just bananas considering his fighting style. It also sounds like he was every bit the masochist that we see on screen as well. Like he would deliberately take punches in matches, and in the lead up to fights, he would allow himself to be sexually aroused just so he could deny himself release. So you'll be pleased to hear that very uncomfortable sex scene that ends with a pitcher of ice water, that was pretty real.
Yeah, that was interesting. There's but I think that makes him an intriguing character, which is what led De Niro to be so enthralled with him. And I think De Niro has quoted as saying like he doesn't want to use the word sympathetic, but he's like a multi-layered character, and in a sense that makes him human, right? And that's what it's like. You don't want to go as far as to say like, oh, we've all made mistakes or we all screw up. Like he is a deplorable human being. He is a piece of garbage, but he's also like, we see all of him, right? And we see every part of him.
Yes.
And we'll get into that. And, there's a great story of when Scorsese finally came on board, and they were down in the Caribbean working on this script, him and De Niro, for a few weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. Like they had the script, and, they were like fine tuning it and kind of working on it every day. And when they got back, the producers actually brought them in for a meeting. And Scorsese thought it was just like a meeting where they were just sort of like, oh, how's the script going? Like, when are we going to develop this? Like, cause they had already signed on. They were already on board for this. But that meeting was actually, in hindsight, they were going to can the film. They were just going to be like, we're not doing this.
Oh, wow.
Because they sort of, they were reading the script, and a few of the producers were like, this LaMotta character, like, why would anybody want to watch him? And they said in the meeting, he's a cockroach. And then De Niro famously said, he's not a cockroach. And it's like how he said he's not a cockroach was actually what changed their minds. He was like, they could tell that in how he said it. I don't think he said it in a threatening way, but he was just like, he's not a cockroach. And then was like, okay. Like, and then I'm sure they talked it out more, but he's not a good person, but he's not a like completely bad person. And he's this really interesting, multi-layered character that I think is worth depicting and discussing.
That's funny because when you said that, I imagined De Niro saying it in a very threatening way. So
right, maybe he did. I don't know.
I would find that compelling. That's just me. I mean, you're right. Like we've talked about this before. I don't want to see moral paragons as our lead characters. They're not terribly interesting. Like a perfect person or, a totally morally upright person is not all that interesting as the focus of a film. So that this guy is flawed, that he is not at his core, a good person. And I think I would disagree. I would push back. I think he is a bad person. I think
Yeah.
pretty much like, as much as anyone can be, he's a pretty bad guy. But that doesn't mean he's not a compelling focus of a character study. In fact, quite the opposite.
Correct.
Like it makes him
Correct.
a very rich character for study. And one of the important aspects of his character, and it's a refrain throughout the movie, is that he wants to do things his own way. He doesn't want to play politics to get a title shot. He doesn't want to be controlled by the mob. But like we mentioned, he ultimately does play ball. He throws a fight in order to get a shot. But he's so adamant about not being controlled, and yet in his own life, he wants to control everything. He is a very controlling guy. It seems like the most important quality for anyone around him, as far as he's concerned, is pliancy. Like his wife, his brother, his second wife, he just constantly orders them around and abuses them pretty horribly.
Yeah, I mean, he's very clearly a horribly shitty husband and a brother for that matter. I mean, we sort of see that even at the start of the film when he's sitting down, the first scene we see with him and Joey, and he's like convincing him to punch him. It's like, you know what I mean? And it's like, but even in that scene, it's like, it's so multi-layered. It's like, yeah, he's being a shitty brother because he's like ordering his little brother to punch him. And you can kind of see this dynamic working out. It's like they're kids, right? And he's sort of like, Joey goes into himself and he's sort of like, no, I'm not going to punch you. I'm not going to punch you. Like, it's like a little brother, right? And he finally convinces him to do it. And now we're seeing this control that he has over Joey. But then we're also getting to see, he's as a boxer or as a fighter, like he's got this special gift. Like he's not going to get knocked out. He's not going to go down.
Yeah.
He can take punches to the face. Like this is his gift. He's never going to go down. He can take an ungodly amount of punishment and he's still going to fight back, and that's what's so kind of great. But I think what really feels like it, like his home is again, like I was sort of saying, this duality that we see in Jake, and it's part of the whole film. We can, in some way root for this guy. It's like, you don't just root for him in the fights, but you're sort of rooting for him to like make better decisions. Like, yeah, like, okay, don't, like, you're rooting for him to just be like, you're gifted, you're special. Like, don't take the fall. Don't take the dive. Don't beat your wife. Don't attack your brother. Like even in the scene when he has a phone, he's on the phone with his brother. We're like, ask for forgiveness. Like in that moment, like just say you're sorry. And it's like, we'll forgive you. Cause we're like so enthralled with him, but he just can't do it. Cause he just keeps making these wrong decisions. And we just slowly see him crumbling before our eyes. It's like, it's like a car wreck. Like you can't turn away.
Well, you're right. And that's really important there. As you say, like we are rooting for him, but not because we love him, not because he is so good. It's because we want him to be better. And it's so, because it seems like, what we're rooting for is him to find his humanity, because he seems to be lacking in humanity, which is interesting because throughout the film, people are constantly calling him an animal. Like it's a refrain throughout the movie. Like when people are arguing in this movie, they're like, you animal, get out of here. You're a friggin' animal. And, there's a pretty powerful moment where, he gets thrown in jail later in the film and he just starts weeping and crying out. He's basically been put in the box. He's in solitary confinement and it's dark. He's crying and he's just calling out that he's not an animal. But it does seem like, for Jake and for a lot of people in this movie, aspects of, of barbarism are just kind of inescapable. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Even when people are talking behind his back, like, when the gangsters, they come and they sort of watch him in training when
Mm.
Tommy's in Goodfellas, when Joey invites him to, at the beginning, and they're sort of like, look at this gorilla. You know what I mean? They call him a
Yeah.
gorilla. Like, you know what I mean? It's just like, and he can't even hear that, but like, that's this sort of comparisons to, like you said, an animal. But that scene you mentioned, it's like, I love that scene in the jail. And it's just like, he is just, like, the depths. He is in like the lowest part. He's in the shadows. It's black and white. You can't see. He's beating himself. He's crying. He's yelling, why? I'm not an animal. I'm not. It reminded me of, there was a couple moments actually. I'm, as I mentioned before, a big Paul Thomas Anderson fan, and I don't know if you've seen Boogie Nights recently. Paul Thomas Anderson.
It's been a while.
Love him, but my favorite director, or my favorite actor of all time, Philip Seymour Hoffman, is in Boogie Nights, and he has that scene where he kind of throws himself at Mark Wahlberg, and the Dirk Diggler character, because he's he works on the films or whatever, and he's a gay guy, and he kisses him on New Year's, and then he's like, whoa. Dirk's like, whoa, no, like I'm not that, like, whatever, and he like kind of walks away. And then the Phil Seymour Hoffman character like goes into the car, and he's just like, he's in the shadows of the car. He's just like, oh, I'm a fucking idiot. I'm a fucking idiot. Oh, fucking idiot. And I was just like rewatching the scene of De Niro being like, repeating like, why? I'm not an animal. I couldn't help but think of Boogie Nights. And then the last scene of the film of Boogie Nights, the iconic scene where Dirk Diggler pulls out his junk, is just reminiscent of the last scene of Raging Bull, when he's like, it's this interesting frame shot of a mirror, and you see him through the mirror, and he's, Jake is doing the warming up before he goes out to do his, his entertainment comedy set. And it's just similar. I was like, oh man, like just seeing these like directors influencing other directors. It's always so fun to see, but that's just me geeking out over movies.
No, and I think you're 100% right in just how seminal and influential so much of this is. Like, I haven't watched The Penguin yet, the new HBO series, but I've seen like little sort of like clips, and I'm positive after watching this movie that Colin Farrell based his character largely on Jake LaMotta, or at least like De Niro's portrayal of Jake LaMotta. Like, just if you watch, like just in the commercials, you can just see like the way he moves, the way he's sort of made up to be sort of this older, overweight guy who's in somewhat in decline physically. And just his attitudes and actions very much seems to be an homage to this. But just sort of keeping with the animal concept just for a second, like, there is like this, it does seem kind of central to who he is. I mean, there's the obvious stuff, like he does wear a leopard spotted robe. He's called the Raging Bull, but there's also this extension of sort of animal behavior, because like we see so many times throughout this, the crowds of people will erupt into brawls. People are not civilized in this movie. And even in like the courtship of Vicky by Jake, there's this weird kind of like animal expectancy to it, as though they're both kind of just operating on instinct rather than love or any kind of interest. It's about the least romantic thing I've ever seen, actually. And the relationships and the dialogue in this film are a difficult thing for me. We'll get to it in due course, but honestly, like, some of the dialogue in this film irritates me. And we will talk about that in time. But before we do get to that point, I think we should talk about the aesthetic of the film, because it is the first thing that strikes you, like right from the get-go. That opening scene where he's just dancing in the ring, it's very slow. It's got, the music is playing. It hits you right away with its beauty as much as its brutality, and we need to talk about that.
Well, if you mentioned that it's probably the least romantic thing you've seen, well, wait till we get to Casino and Joe Pesci hooking up with Sharon Stone. Talk about least romantic. That scene is hard to watch. We'll
debate it when we get to it.
We'll get to that in a week or two. I can hear what you're saying. It's difficult, and that love, but like you said, the aesthetic I think is interesting, and like even there's like animalistic sounds of in the film,
Yes.
like in the fight scenes. Like there's use of like horses and like elephants and stuff. This the sound mix is just it's just incredible. But like, you know, in speaking about the aesthetic, obviously the first thing we want to touch on is the black and white, right?
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting because you wonder, like, this film was made in 1980. It's set in, well, between the 40s
Yeah.
up to the 50s and a little thereafter in his later stages, but primarily in that era. So the question, like, I would have, is to a filmmaker is like, how do you make 1980 feel like 1940? And I think there's more to it than just making it in black and white, because that's the short answer for sure. But I found watching this, like, there's a texture to this movie
Yeah.
that makes it feel appropriately aged. And I'm just sort of wondering, like how do you do that? How does Scorsese
Yeah.
achieve that?
Well, I mean, it is. I mean, you watch it and you're like, this film was made in the 40s or 50s. You know what I mean? It feels like it was made in the time where it was set, which is like a very skillful thing, right? You kind of forget this was like, oh, this was made in the 80s. Like Back to the Future was made a couple years later. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
you're like, sort of like, these kind of were made at the same time, sort of thing. I was just thinking of like a colorful movie that went back in, in the 50s, but like that movie doesn't feel like it's made in the 50s. You know, it's kind of like but like you said, okay, so the black and white, for example, during pre-production they were thinking, okay, so like how are we going to shoot this? And I think De Niro and Scorsese are both like, yeah, I think it should be black and white. They asked Joe Pesci, just were like randomly, they were like, what do you think? And he's like, black and white, like instantly. And it was like, yeah, okay, so we all have the same response. It was like the idea for it being black and white was twofold. Scorsese is obviously known for being a cinephile, like a film purist, and I feel like he wants to, like, the preservation of film is important. And back when this was made, they didn't have the technology to keep color in film yet. It was like color and in film like degraded over time, and there was like not that they couldn't. They I guess they might have been on the cusp of it, but it was like sort of known that, like, okay, if you have color in movies, after about 10 years it starts to fade. It starts to, like, because there's no digital, there's nothing, like, it was just like that's how film was. So it was like in his head he was like he didn't want the aesthetic and the of the film to fade over time. And then also he was showing it to a film. He sort of, De Niro, like, had been training and he shot a bunch of stuff sort of on, like, kind of like a little video camera or whatever in a gym, like him training, whatever. And it was just this color footage. And he was showing it to his friend, Scorsese was. He was like, man, look at this. And he was like, watching De Niro, and like De Niro obviously really got into shape in this, but also like really trained hard. And he was like, so what do you think? Like, what do you think of this? Like this kind of like whatever. And he says, yeah, the gloves aren't the right color. And it's like De Niro had the red gloves. And he was like, oh. Scorsese was like, yeah, because back in the 40s, 50s, they were using sort of like more of a brownish glove. And sort of he was just like, yeah, like I'm used to seeing it on TV in black and white, right? And that's how people consume boxing, unless you were there in person, which is like was obviously rare for an average person. So like, yeah, if for them it was black and white, and obviously black and white just gives that strong aesthetic to the past, right? I think it's yeah, it's definitely one of the primary factors in why the film feels dated, or gives it that look, not dated, I should say.
Right. But one of the things I noticed too, like during one of the Sugar Ray fights, I think it's the third of the 6 fights they would have, which is pretty astounding.
Yeah.
But there's this really great isolation of the fighters. That, like, the camera zooms in, the surroundings go narrow and dark, and we're just left with a portrait, I guess, of a fighter. Yeah. And I love that. And I think really the in-ring cinematography is the best part of this whole movie. There's moments where you see things like there's heat waves and smoke, and there's these haunting, wailing, kind of keening sounds. You mentioned it, like that, like they incorporated like elephants and horses and like all these different things into the sound mixing. And it's all very primal and very beautiful. Yeah. And like, yeah, like what did you dig up like about the fight sequences, from the technical perspective?
Yeah, man, that's you're so right about that. Like that image you're talking about was the classic. It's now considered like a classic shot in cinema. It's the dolly zoom, right? So you're coming
Mm.
through on a dolly and you're zooming at the same time. I'm assuming you're talking about that shot too. It starts kind of like above Sugar Ray and kind of comes down, and then the lights focus on him, and he's sort of
Yes.
like you said, and then it kind of the reverse
Even like sort
shot
of
is
cocked, his fist is sort of up like
yeah,
this for
yeah,
a second. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. But the great thing about this was like Scorsese wanted everything to be in the ring, so it's like there's very few shots outside of the ropes. He felt like the ropes made it not feel like you were part of the fight, or you're not getting it from Jake's perspective, right? You're
Right.
you're witnessing it from the crowd. He wanted to be in. So there's a handful of shots in the film that are kind of from outside, and they're like there's this interesting shot of like the commentator calling the fight and you see their feet, which is interesting. But like most of it, all the
Mm.
fighting is inside the ring. And they had like 3 different rings. I think they had this massive ring for one of them, this big, huge, wide open for the fight, the very first fight that he's like fluid and he knocks down Sugar Ray and he's like, he's moving and there's this like all this openness. It's like earlier on in the film. And yeah, it feels like loose and that's the one where he doesn't win the fight, but he wins it. He knocks him down and they say like he got screwed or whatever. And then, like you said, during
Yeah.
the third one that's depicted, it's like you said, there's it's claustrophobic. They use this really small ring, so you're like tight in. It's like there's nowhere to move. It's
Mm.
claustrophobic. The whole film is claustrophobic. The whole film takes place inside, like 90% of it. There's a scene of Joey and Tommy or whatever, walking down the street at the beginning. There's like shots of them by the pool, but like
Yeah.
mostly it's like claustrophobic, tight hallways, tight
True.
like places. And then there's that scene, I guess, where he's walking outside where Vicky attacks him, or he attacks Vicky or whatever when he's going to confront Joey. But like, yeah,
Yeah.
there's all it's like it's everything's tight, and they use that in the ring as well. And like the smoke, like you said, they actually built like these little they had fire around the ring, so to create actual smoke and like so it looks like this you're actually descending into hell. Like this is his
Oh
hell
man.
sort of thing. And yeah, they use like the camera speeds. They use various camera speeds. So it's like all the editing and the cutting. It's like, it's very like Scorsese wanted to be like, very disjointed. It's like sometimes you don't even know, like in that, I would assume that's like a lot in what boxing is like, right? Like sometimes you don't even know when a punch is coming, right? So you don't even know sometimes when a hit happens, but then all the stuff in the corner between it is like slow motion, and you see like
Mm.
the sponge on his back, and it's like very like slow, and he's sort of looking, and it's this varying degrees of like speed and fluent versus like slow and like methodical, and it's contrasting those moments. I know you mentioned earlier about the opening scene. It's the last thing I'll make a point about the opening ring, but like that dancing is so, like you said, it's beautiful. It's like him getting
Yes.
ready and everything's in slow motion. He's dancing. We don't see, and that's kind of like the last moment in the film that you feel like, at least sort of feel like hope. And it's like you have this like emptiness beside him that's like, kind of, you could kind of take it as like possibilities, endless possibilities for this like dancing fighter. This sort of like, you have like the future. This is like any way you want to go. This is what's going to happen. You have this like you said, and
Right.
it's all in slow motion, and there's beauty. And then it just cuts to an evening with Jake LaMotta, and then it's like him in the like this like messed up face, overweight guy
Mm.
practicing like comedy routine in a dressing room, and you're like, oh shit, like what the hell happened? And then
Right.
you're off and running.
Well, that's really cool too, because at that point in that opening, we don't know who he is yet. So you're right. Like, not only
Right.
is like the future is totally open, both for the events of the film and for who this guy is. We don't know.
Exactly.
And yeah, no, I love that. And what you mentioned too about how all the shots during the fights are from inside the ring. So your perspective
Yeah,
is that of the fighter. And I think that
exactly.
is really important. And when we talk about I think the end, which we will later, that sort of helped crystallize a thought just now for me about the ending and about what that means, this concept of perspective. And
Yeah,
you're right, we are always in the ring, we are seeing things as the fighter sees it and experiencing things as the fighter experiences it. There is this narrowing of the world to you and your opponent. It is kind of frenetic, and you're probably getting, your head's knocked around, you're not thinking straight, things can get like a little messed up, a little blurry. Then you have these
yeah,
moments of reprieve in the corner where you're getting sort of, washed off. And some of the shots with the sponge are incredible too, because it's a literal bloodbath. He's pouring like
yeah,
water over him that is actually really mostly blood at this point. And
yeah.
yeah, no, that's cool. I'm really glad. I'm really glad you brought that up. That actually just sort of made some things clearer for me now. And I mentioned earlier how I wasn't wild about all of the dialogue, and
Yeah,
like, I should be clear. Sometimes it's great, and I always thought it was delivered impeccably because the acting in this
yeah.
movie is so good. But the style wore on me a bit,
Hmm.
specifically between Jake, Joey, and Vicky. And every conversation just sort of seemed like Jake was misinterpreting what someone said and then using that to bully them. Like
Yeah,
seriously, some of the scenes were just unending streams of Jake saying, "What do you mean? What are you talking about? What are you trying to say?" And then he just weaponizes what they said because of how insecure he is. And that is an interesting part of the character, but I also sort of felt like I got the point after a while, and I wish I didn't have to
right.
listen to it anymore. Like, I don't know, did that get to you at all? Like, am I alone in this?
No, I mean, I for one, I mean, I get it. You know, but for me, I can listen to these guys talk every day, and I like,
Sure.
I can't disagree with you on like like the emphasis on Jake's jealousy and paranoia is sort of like hammered home, hammered home, hammered home. And again, we're sort of
Yeah.
seeing it from his point of view, right? Even when he's like, we see Vicky go and say goodbye to Tommy, and it's like she's like, I just said goodbye to him, and it's like we see it like she probably just leaned in and gave him a kiss, and that was it. But the way they shoot it is like they leans in slow, and it's like this slow, long kiss, and it's like, whoa, that is like pretty familiar, you know what I mean? And it's like,
Yeah.
again, not justifying it, but we're seeing it from his point of view, right?
Mm.
And there's a truth to that, you know. What we're being seen, it doesn't mean that we have to agree with what's happening, but there's I think this is what makes De Niro so special. It's that there's an honesty in the portrayal, and the depiction is what, for
Mm.
me, like encapsulates it for me, is because he's not going to settle for just like, oh, I'm going to be a piece of shit. It's like, no, there has to be truth and honesty to that, I feel.
Well, you're right in that. I mean, point of view is truth. Truth is not
Correct.
a concrete thing. Like, there's a difference between fact
Right.
and truth. Indiana Jones said it best. Archaeology is the pursuit of fact. If you want truth, the philosophy class is right down the hall. And so, like, that
I
is what
love
we're
it.
getting here. We are getting truth as he sees it. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's weird. Like, I found I did hate some things about the movie, or at points I hated things. Really, just those stretches of dialogue. But at no point did I not think the movie was great. Like, I was always
Interesting.
totally
Yeah.
engrossed. And I think one of the things, just like, for me to actually have been around anyone like the people in this movie would be a version of hell, because like, just everyone talks with their mouths full. They're hyper confrontational. No one is
Yeah.
vaguely intellectual. It's a fucking nightmare in a lot of ways. So if this was real life to me, I would be in actual hell. And I think maybe that's my bias coming in.
Right. I guess, but the question is, I think you said it, like, it's interesting, and that's the sort of the question. And like, no
Always,
doubt,
always interesting.
you don't want to be in this. Yeah, you don't want to be in this world. That would be awful. Yeah, it's like it's like we're all sort of Larry. Like, the Larry is the neighbor at the beginning of the movie where he says,
Yeah.
he's like, what? He was like, shut the fuck. He's like, shut the fuck up. Stop fucking fighting. It's like, shut the fuck up, Larry. And
Well,
he's like,
I hate Larry too.
you're a
Larry's no
fucking
better.
dog.
Yeah, Larry's no better. I hate
Shut
him
your
too.
fucking dog up or whatever. Yeah, apparently
Yeah.
that was like Scorsese like threw it up that like during that scene that Scorsese threw it a props guy in and was like just like yell at him like shut the fuck up. And it's like when Scorsese, can you leave that fucking guy or whatever? He's just like, he's improvising, and then they worked it out and then worked it in, and it's great. It's just this weird kind of moment. But yeah, and then there's also the like talking about the dialogue, and there's this, it's everything's sort of confrontational. Nothing's just sort of like, hey, get me the coffee. It's like, you're not going to get the coffee.
Yeah.
It's like, he literally asked her, she's like, 1 second. And then it's like, how long do I got to wait for the coffee? Like, it's like literally like, well, how long are you going to make me wait? He's like, that was his next words out of his mouth. And it's like, oh my gosh, like everything's confrontational. Everything's a fight. But that's who this guy is. The only part of the film, which I think is kind of really beautiful in the moments, is the home video footage. And it's like, you have this like montage of it's a dreamlike sequence. It's in color, so it's different from the rest of the film. It feels like this is what could have been. This is what could have been your life, man. Like, you could have had the happy home, the wife, the kids, everybody's happy playing. You got your brother there. You're all best friends. It's what could have been, and it's not. There's obviously very pointed that there's no dialogue in that part, and that it's in color. It feels like a dream sequence. It feels like something different. Right. It's very, it's very beautiful. Another little sidebar about that home video footage was that the DP, Michael Chapman, he had shot Taxi Driver with Scorsese. He was a very good DP. He never shot anything in black and white. So that was kind of exciting for him, shooting the film in black and white. But when they wanted to do this sort of like montage of like, the home video footage, LaMotta actually had that footage. So they had like watched all of his sort of home movies and stuff. And so they wanted, and obviously, how home movies work, especially like at that time, it's like very raw, right? And so he tried to shoot it, and he was like, this is not working. Like, this is like, they had the right camera, they obviously had the actors or whatever, but it's just like, it's like when you're a DP, sometimes it's like, you obviously want to frame things a certain way, and your innate, artistic side is like, oh, I can't like be like shooting the ground or like out of focus or whatever. So he just went to Scorsese, was like, I can't shoot this. And then Scorsese was like, okay, I'll shoot it. So then Scorsese does it, and he has the same problem. He's like, I can't. They just have the same issue. And so then Scorsese, he's like essentially grabbed like, again, like some random, like, I don't know like props guy or like
Larry. He grabbed Larry.
Yeah, you grab Larry or grab like a PA or like just like a random guy, was like, hey, and he just got this person to film these sequences, and that's like, they're sort of janky and like all out of sorts, but it like fits it perfectly because it's like exactly what you would think a home movie is. So that's kind of a fun little moment. But I guess I am curious, besides the like you said, your issues with the dialogue, in kind of those moments, was there anything else that didn't work for you? What did you think about the ending, for example, like how the film sort of clues up? Does that work?
Yeah. Yes, very much so, actually. I mean, I love the ending, to truth be told. And what really left me wondering, was there's this biblical quote on the end title card. And it's from John 9:25, and it says, so I'm quoting here now. So for the second time, the Pharisees summoned the man who had been blind and said, speak the truth before God. We know this fellow is a sinner, referring to Jesus. To which the man replies, whether or not he is a sinner, I do not know. All I know is this. Once I was blind, and now I can see. So for anyone unfamiliar, this is a scene from the Bible where the Pharisees, the religious authority of the time, they're attempting to discredit Jesus. And so they're interviewing witnesses to his so-called miracles. Specifically here, the blind man who was made to see. So first, when I was seeing that, I was wondering if the movie was asking us to consider whether or not Jake LaMotta was a sinner, or whether any of us are fit to judge him. And, if he is what he is because that's the way the world made him. And maybe that last bit has some ring of truth to him, ring of truth to it. But, I don't think, if it's asking us to question whether or not, he is a good guy, that's not a great conclusion, because I don't think there's any moral ambiguity surrounding him at all. And I don't
Right.
think that's what it is. I don't think that's what it's asking us. Did you I think that was a faulty first impression. I eventually had other thoughts, but like when you first saw that, like was that sort of what you thought it was asking of you?
Yeah, I don't. I think this is something that Scorsese is sort of obsessed with in all of his films, uh, and I think it's because he's flawed and makes awful and terrible choices. It doesn't mean that that's all he is, right? I think he's still, like we were saying earlier, he's just like, he's still human, and even if even if you're not a decent person, you're still human, you know. And that's his trouble, right? Is that it's like he can't get out of his own way. I don't think it's presenting him as like, is he a sinner? But I think it's something that just Scorsese himself is just so obsessed with, and like, and even more so, indulgence, sin through indulgence. And we're talking about that. I was talking about that. Even when I was mentioning him in the hospital and the so-called drug use and stuff, like it's him being overindulgent and feeling like he's Jake LaMotta in this. Like he feels like he's a sinner. He's needs redemption, and he has to figure this out. But it's in Jake's case, it's not an indulgence of like money, like say in Goodfellas or Casino, or or drugs like in Wolf of Wall Street, or like with women like in Wolf of Wall Street or something. But it's an indulgence of like shame and guilt, and like he feels like, and like pain, and he needs to overindulge on pain to feel sort of anything that can try to save himself, and the shame and the guilt of being who he is. It's more interesting to bring truth to that character than it is to just make him like all good or sort of all bad, right? And when I saw this too, it's like I couldn't help but, like you said, we were just watching the Rocky movies, and like it made me sort of second guess that Rocky character a bit, and be like, LaMotta, I think, is all he is, like you said, a deplorable human being, but he's at the same time, it's like, I don't think we're justifying what he's doing, but I think we're presenting ideas that be like, not like, this is why he beats his wife. It's like, no, it's like he's just this very, very flawed character on so many different levels.
Yeah. Rocky is an ideal, and LaMotta is truth. I started to reconsider it, like the biblical quote as not something that was moralistic in nature, because I think
Right.
what it does is kind of dismisses moral judgment, and rather it asks us to consider an objective truth. So it says, whether or not he's a sinner, I don't know. What I do know is this: I was once blind and now I see. So the last bit, that statement, that is beyond ambiguity or interpretation. So
Right.
rather that, so like, this is a weird biopic in that, like, it is done in consultation with Jake LaMotta. Jake LaMotta was involved in making this, and it's obviously based on his autobiography. But it does not exonerate or lionize him, as you said. And I think this final quotation is maybe asking us to just consider what is definitively true, and not to extend our judgment beyond that. And it does come up after, like, it says, like, at the end, he says a tribute to, I can't remember the name of the guy, but Marty sort of pays tribute to a teacher of his. And I think maybe this quote can also just be thought of as a lesson to filmmakers, saying, observe your subject in its truth, and show that.
Right.
Show the truth, show what you know. Don't extend beyond that. And I think there's something really beautiful, and it can be disturbing, it can be off-putting, it can be all those things, and that is what truth is. Truth can be harsh and upsetting. And
Yeah.
do you even with all that being said, do you think we are meant to feel bad in any way about his fall from grace? Because like you said, we do come to root for him in a way, even though we acknowledge his lack of humanity. Did part of you sort of at the end kind of feel, oh, like, did you feel sympathetic for him in any way, I guess?
I don't think it's a case of feeling bad for Jake. I think it's a case of like realizing or coming to terms with who he is and what he's become at the end. And it's the faded, the lost dreams, the lack of hope, like that potential of being a champion that we sort of see at the very first shot of the film of him being in the ring by himself with sort of all the opportunity in the world. There's and then him being in a claustrophobic locker room, overweight, reciting like words from other movies. I read this article from the critic's name is Sheila O'Malley about the film, where she talks about that final scene and where Jake is reciting the line from On the Waterfront, the Marlon
Right, yeah.
Brando, the famous film about a boxer, and he's saying it to his brother, which is just sort of like mimicking the story that we're watching right now. But in the film On the Waterfront, the most famous line is, of course, "I could have been somebody. Like I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody." And that's how Brando reads the line in the film. De Niro chooses to read the line. He's reciting the same thing, and then he says, "I could have been somebody," and he emphasizes "been" versus emphasizing what Brando does is somebody. And it's just, that's such a cool thing that the critics kind of pointed out, and I was like, oh man, that's such an interesting choice, right? That it's like you're not mimicking the line like Brando. He's putting this little twist on it, and it's the emphasis on what Jake is not getting, or what Jake is. He's holding on to the past. He's holding on to, like, been there. I've been there. It's a past tense, right? It's he's holding on to being relevant. He's holding on to something that never was, versus like being somebody, right? Being somebody, being the importance. Like, you're always going to be that somebody. You're always going to be somebody of relevance, versus hanging on to something in the past. And I thought that was just such a cool little way to finish the film, but a really great choice by De Niro in that moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost as if he sees his eventual, like, where he winds up as in like inevitability. You know what I mean? Like, I could have been somebody, like you say. It's the past could have been better. What's happening now, what eventually comes to pass, was always going to be. It was always going to be this way. I was always going to degrade and rust and just sort of become what I am now. But I could have been somebody, and that still just sort of keeps bringing up ideas of perspective. And when you, that's what I was talking about earlier when I said, like, the things that you talked about with the filmmaking and how the shots were all in the ring from the fighter's perspective. That really helped me sort of think a different way about this ending, and how so much of the film does come down to perspective. And yeah, that's I do really like that. And it's interesting though. Like, I think, we see this, I think, with a few characters in Scorsese movies, and we're going to talk about, a few of them in the coming weeks. But a lot of them seem to be, they either seem to express regret, or are representative themselves of regret, of something lost. And
Yeah.
I feel like that's an aspect of Henry Hill in Goodfellas. I think it's something about Sam Rothstein, in Casino. And it's definitely something about Jake LaMotta here. There is regret, and whether or not that thing that lost is worthy of all of our lamenting, or not, that's debatable. But for these guys, from their perspective, there is something lost, and yeah, that seems to be an important aspect of their character. So I'll be interested in discussing that in the next few films.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on those. And then with the Irishman, which I know you haven't seen yet, there's definitely those aspects as well. So that'll be those will be fun discussions. But we have to get into the question we are now lamenting over ourselves, and that is Raging Bull a hell of a picture? So David, what are your thoughts? your final concluding thoughts.
Yeah, we've had a few thoughts, but yeah, I mean, like I said, there were things I didn't love. Really, just those bits of dialogue that we talked about. Certainly, the dialogue itself was largely, great, natural, very gritty, very, seemed very very unscripted and organic. And like I said, I was totally engrossed throughout the whole thing, right from the jump. The opening couple of minutes that we talked about, it kind of grabs you and demands your attention. And
Yeah.
directorially, this is a gem, undoubtedly. The performances are beyond reproach, and I guess I was sort of wrestling with how much I could disregard, how much I can not like about a movie and still love the movie. And this is a great film. I don't know if I can love it because of how much the essential relationships irk me, or at least the dialogue within them. But it's undeniably great, and especially now having spoken to you about it, I think that really sort of solidifies it for me. That yeah, it's a hell of a picture.
On the fence, but I convinced you. I love it. That's
You did,
great.
you did.
This
Well
is,
done.
yeah, this is man, this is such. I mean, this might be top tier hell of a picture for me. I think there's just so much right with this movie. It doesn't drag because I feel like Scorsese, if there is one sort of people can argue about with him, like he sometimes has a tendency to have his films drag on a bit, and doesn't drag. I feel like it moves quick, and the editing, the aesthetics, the performances. I think we have to remember too with this performance that De Niro, they stopped shooting for 4 months. So they shot all like the in-ring stuff, all the sort of before stuff, and then they took 4 months off. He gained 60 pounds. Like
Saw that.
They were
60.
talking about like, yeah, they were like, oh, you can just wear like aesthetic, like prosthetics, and like where we can like, and he's like, no, I have to gain the weight. I have to know what it feels like. And that's the type of actor he is. This was before the Christian Bales and the Matthew McConaughey's and the, all these kind of actors that, make a killing off of dropping 60 pounds in a week for a film or something. You know what I mean? This was like sort of the first kind of, oh man, he's put on 60 pounds. He's with serious health issues from this.
Yeah.
So
no
yeah,
kidding.
yeah, it's pretty incredible for me, without a doubt, a hell of a picture. And, Scorsese's up there. He's one of my goats. And I always sort of forget how great this movie is until I revisit it. And I'm like, man, it is just captivating. So I'm very excited for what we have in store with our discussion next week, which is something a little different. I know we were, like we've been discussing all episode. Next week, we're going to be talking about another Scorsese, or are we doing something else, David? Why don't you tell everybody what we're going to be doing next week for our Scorsese, De Niro, Pesci?
Well, I'm sort of on the hook a little bit because I wasn't sure we had reached a final conclusion on,
Okay,
on how we were going to go
I will
about
let
this.
everybody
Yeah,
know.
please. Yeah, you
so,
seem to have made up your mind. So.
I made it up. We're doing it. This is So we'd already obviously told everybody that we're doing, the 4 movies with Pesci, De Niro, and Pacino, or not Pacino, and Scorsese collabed on. So that would be Raging Bull, Goodfellas, Casino, and The Irishman. But instead of doing 2 episodes on Goodfellas and Casino, we're going to combine them, and we're going to play around with talking about sort of 2 films that a lot of people that have a lot of similarities, a lot of obviously the same actors and the big roles, a lot of similar like side character actors as well, a lot same subject matter. Goodfellas and
same
Casino,
screenwriter.
Same screenwriter, yeah. So it's like a lot of similarities between the 2 pictures, and we're gonna kind of combine them into one, and we're gonna discuss sort of them as companion pieces, and we're gonna see how that goes. We haven't done that yet in a episode. We obviously reference a lot of other films that we've talked about and other films that filmmakers and directors and actors have been in or created, but we haven't kind of discussed these 2 films or 2 films together on one episode. So we're going to do that on next week's episode. So it'll be Goodfellas and Casino. And I guess we'll still come to the conclusion if they're if one is a hell of a pitcher or if they're both hell of a pitchers, we'll sort of figure that out as we discuss.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we are doing that because that's what I was hoping you were going to say.
Yeah,
I think that'll
sorry,
be
we
very
didn't
interesting. Maybe we did. I'm often forgetful. So I think that's going to be really cool. A really great way to discuss those two films because they, rightly so, are often thought of together, and so I think discussing one demands that you discuss them both, and. Yeah, looking forward to that. It means we're gonna have to watch more movies in 1 week, but I guess we'll endure. That's okay.
Yeah, we will endure. This isn't. Nobody's putting a gun to our head on these, but
certainly not.
Yeah, Goodfellas and Casino. That's a good rewatch for. And you've seen both of those, right? Obviously,
I have. Yeah, multiple times, of course. Yeah, those are.
They're ones that I revisit at least once a year. So it's like I can kind of recite scenes from them. Like a lot, so they're great rewatches. So I'm not.
I've seen Goodfellas recently. I haven't seen Casino in a few years. So it's and if I'm remembering well, I'm pretty sure that right now, if you had to make me pick one, I think Casino is my preferred of the two films, which I think places me in the minority. So. But like I said, it's been a while since I've seen it, so it'll be interesting to watch them in succession and to see if that holds true.
Yeah, because I tend to flip flop. It was Casino for me for a long, long time, and then I rewatched Goodfellas last year. I was like, man, I think Goodfellas is my favorite Scorsese. Might even be one of my favorite films of all time. And then I'm gonna rewatch Casino and be like, oh, I'm in a big casino mood. Like I like gambling and be like, oh, I've been gambling lately. So it's like, oh, sweet. I love Casino again. It's just brilliant, man. They're both brilliant. So we're going to talk about them as nice companion pieces. I think it's great. And okay, so that's next week. But we got another hell of a pitcher, Raging Bull. I had to sort of convince you a bit of it. So that's sort of fun for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then, so for David Hollingshurst, my name is Andrew Bartlett, and we will see you guys all again next week on another episode of Hell of a Picture.